July 23rd, 1945. 2:17 in the morning. The eastern coast of Karafudo, Japanese-occupied Sakhalin Island. 8 American sailors crawled through the freezing darkness, their bellies pressed against foreign soil. Behind them, the Pacific Ocean reflected nothing. No moon, no stars, just blackness. Ahead of them, a Japanese railroad track cut through the night like a scar. They were not supposed to be here. No American submarine crew had ever set foot on enemy territory to conduct a land attack, not once in the entire history of the United States Navy. What these 8 men were attempting had never been done before, and their commanding officer, watching through his periscope from 300 yards offshore, had given them exactly 10 minutes to complete the mission. 10 minutes to plant the explosives. 10 minutes to rig the detonator. 10 minutes to get back to the rubber boats before Japanese patrols discovered them. If anything went wrong, if a single enemy soldier spotted them, if a dog barked, if the train came early, there would be no rescue. Commander Eugene Fluckey had made that perfectly clear. The submarine would have to leave them behind. And right now, as the 8 men dug frantically into the rocky soil beneath the railroad tracks, the unmistakable sound of a locomotive whistle pierced the silence. The train was coming early. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and like this video. These true stories from history deserve to be told, and your support helps make that possible. Now, let's go back to understand how these 8 ordinary sailors ended up in the most extraordinary situation of their lives. The man responsible for putting them there was Commander Eugene Bennett Fluckey. And to understand how audacious, how utterly insane this mission truly was, you need to understand the man who dreamed it up. Eugene Fluckey was born in Washington, D.C. in 1913. His father was a government clerk, his mother a homemaker, and nothing about his early childhood suggested he would become one of the most decorated submarine commanders in American history. He was small for his age, bookish, and more interested in taking things apart to see how they worked than in athletics or social activities. But there was something else about young Eugene that set him apart, an almost pathological inability to accept the word impossible. When he was 12 years old, his father took him to the Navy Yard in Washington to see the submarines. Eugene stood on the dock, staring at those strange metal tubes that could disappear beneath the waves, and something clicked in his mind. From that moment on, there was never any question about what he would do with his life. He entered the Naval Academy in 1931, during the depths of the Great Depression. While other young men struggled to find any work at all, Fluckey threw himself into his studies with an intensity that concerned his instructors. He graduated in 1935 and immediately requested submarine duty. The Navy denied him. At 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds, they said he was too small. Submarines were cramped, dangerous, and required physical stamina that officers doubted he possessed. They assigned him to surface ships instead. But what they didn't know was that they had just told Eugene Fluckey something was impossible. For the next 3 years, he served on surface vessels while simultaneously submitting transfer request after transfer request to the submarine service. Each one was denied. Each denial made him more determined. Finally, in 1938, the Navy relented and sent him to submarine school. He was 25 years old and his real education was about to begin. Submarine warfare in the late 1930s was considered unglamorous and slightly disreputable by much of the naval establishment. Surface admirals viewed submarines as sneaky, underhanded vessels that violated the traditional rules of naval engagement. The submarine service attracted officers who didn't fit the conventional mold, men who were too unconventional, too independent, too willing to question orders. Fluckey fit right in. He served on several submarines in the years leading up to World War II, learning the intricate dance of underwater warfare, how to stalk a target, how to calculate torpedo solutions in his head, how to sense the presence of enemy ships through nothing but intuition and the faint readings on primitive sonar equipment. But nothing had prepared him for what happened on December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor caught Fluckey in a stateside training assignment. Like every other American in uniform, he was desperate to get into the fight. But it would take more than 2 years before he got his chance to command his own submarine. Those 2 years were not wasted. Fluckey served as executive officer on the USS Bonita during several war patrols. The Bonita's commander was competent but cautious. He followed the Navy's doctrine to the letter, attacking only when the conditions were perfect, withdrawing at the first sign of danger. The patrols were successful by official standards, but something about them gnawed at Fluckey. He began keeping a private notebook filled with observations about what he would do differently if he were in command. He noticed that the most aggressive skippers, the ones who pushed closer, attacked faster, took calculated risks, were sinking far more enemy ships than those who played it safe. He studied their patrol reports the way a scholar studies ancient texts, looking for patterns, seeking the secrets of their success. One name kept appearing in those reports: Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton of the USS Wahoo. Morton was a legend in the submarine force. He pushed his boat and crew to the absolute limit, attacking convoys in broad daylight, surfacing to finish off damaged ships with his deck gun, pursuing enemy vessels into waters so shallow that conventional wisdom said it was suicide. His patrol reports read like adventure novels, and they produced results that stunned the Navy brass. Morton's crew would follow him anywhere, and Flucky began to understand why. It wasn't just aggression that made Morton successful, it was trust. Morton treated every man on his submarine as an equal partner in the fight. He explained his decisions, listened to suggestions from the lowest enlisted men, and created an atmosphere where innovation was not just accepted, but expected. When Morton and the Wahoo were lost in October 1943, the submarine force mourned a hero, but Eugene Flucky had learned lessons that would shape his entire career. In April 1944, Flucky finally received the orders he had been waiting for. He was given command of the USS Barb, a Gatto-class fleet submarine that had already completed 4 war patrols under other commanders. The Barb had a solid record, but nothing exceptional. That was about to change. From the moment Flucky stepped aboard, the crew sensed something different. Most submarine commanders maintained a formal distance from their enlisted men. It was considered essential for discipline. Flucky did the opposite. He walked through the boat, shaking hands, asking names, inquiring about hometowns and families. Within a week, he had memorized the name and background of every one of his 82 crewmen. But that wasn't the change that shocked them most. On his first day in command, Flucky gathered the entire crew in the forward torpedo room. The space was cramped, humid, and smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed men. It was the closest thing to a meeting hall a submarine possessed. What he told them broke every rule in the Naval Officer's Handbook. "I want you to forget everything you think you know about how a submarine operates," Flucky said. "From this moment on, every man on this boat has permission, no, he has the obligation, to tell me if he thinks I'm about to do something stupid. I don't care if you're the newest seaman aboard or if you've never set foot on a submarine before. If you see something, say something." The crew exchanged uncertain glances. This had to be some kind of test. "I'm not joking," Flucky continued. "The enemy wants to kill us. Our job is to kill them first. And the only way we survive, the only way we win, is if every single one of you is thinking, every second, about how we can do this better. The Navy has rules, the Navy has doctrine, and the Navy is losing this war by following them blindly." He paused, letting that sink in. "We're not going to follow them blindly. We're going to win." The Barb's 5th War Patrol, Flucky's first in command, began in May 1944. They were assigned to the Kuril Islands, a volcanic chain stretching from Japan toward Russia, some of the most heavily patrolled waters in the Pacific. Standard doctrine called for submarines to approach their patrol areas submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh the air. It was slow, cautious, and safe. Flucky threw out the doctrine on day 1. "We're running on the surface whenever possible," he announced. "Day or night. We'll dive if we have to, but a submarine on the surface is faster, sees farther, and fights better than one hiding underwater." His officers were horrified. The Kuril Islands were crawling with Japanese patrol aircraft. Running on the surface was practically begging to be spotted and bombed. But Flucky had calculated the odds. Japanese patrol aircraft in that region had a detection range of approximately 12 miles and good visibility. The Barb's lookouts, with their powerful binoculars, could spot an aircraft at 15 miles. That gave them a 3-minute window to crash dive before being seen. 3 minutes wasn't much, but it was enough for a well-trained crew. And Flucky intended to make his crew the best trained in the Pacific. He ran diving drills constantly, at all hours, without warning, until the men could take the Barb from surface cruising to periscope depth in under 45 seconds. He practiced gun drills, torpedo drills, damage control drills. The crew grumbled at first, then grew proud as they realized how good they were becoming. On June 1st, 1944, the Barb found her first target, a Japanese freighter of approximately 4,000 tons, escorted by 2 patrol boats. Standard doctrine called for attacking from periscope depth, firing a spread of torpedoes, then diving deep to avoid the counterattack. Flucky surfaced. "What are you doing, Captain?" his executive officer demanded. "The deck gun crew has been training for 3 weeks. It's time they got some practice." The Barb's 4-inch deck gun had a range of over 9,000 yards. The Japanese patrol boats had guns that could barely reach 5,000. Flucky positioned his submarine at 7,000 yards and opened fire. It was not elegant. The deck gun crew was nervous, the seas were rough, and their first dozen shots missed badly. But Flucky didn't dive. He kept the Barb on the surface, calmly calling out corrections, until the crew found their rhythm. 20 minutes later, the freighter was burning from stem to stern. The patrol boats fled. The Barb had drawn first blood, and they hadn't even used a torpedo. Word of Flucky's tactics spread through the submarine force. Some commanders thought he was reckless. Others studied his methods closely, but no one could argue with his results. The 5th Patrol ended with 3 ships confirmed, sunk, and 2 more damaged. It was an impressive debut, but Flucky was just getting started. The 6th Patrol, which began in August 1944, would establish the Barb as one of the most dangerous submarines in the Pacific. Flucky had spent the brief interval between patrols studying every piece of intelligence he could find about Japanese convoy patterns. He noticed something that other commanders had missed. The Japanese were routing more and more of their supply convoys through the Yellow Sea and along the coast of China, believing these waters too shallow and too well defended for American submarines to operate effectively. They were wrong. Flucky requested assignment to the Yellow Sea. His superiors were skeptical. The waters there were often less than 100 feet deep, leaving almost no room for a submarine to maneuver if attacked, but they granted his request. What followed was a masterclass in aggressive submarine warfare. On August 31st, the Barb intercepted a convoy of 6 merchant ships escorted by 4 destroyers. A cautious commander would have let the convoy pass. The odds were terrible, the waters were shallow, and the escorts were numerous. Flucky attacked at night, on the surface, at flank speed. He drove the Barb straight through the convoy's escort screen, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. 3 ships went down before the Japanese even understood what was happening. Then Flucky reversed course and escaped through the chaos he had created, the destroyer's sonar hopelessly confused by the wrecks and survivors in the water. It was audacious, it was brilliant, and it was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, Flucky topped himself. The Barb encountered a massive convoy, 17 merchant ships and 12 escorts, in the Formosa Strait. Any reasonable assessment said an attack was impossible. The escorts were alert, the sea was calm, and there was nowhere to hide. Flucky spent 14 hours tracking the convoy, studying its patterns, looking for weakness. He found it just after midnight, a gap in the escort screen where 2 destroyers had drifted slightly apart. The Barb slipped through the gap like a ghost. For the next 90 minutes, Flucky conducted an attack that would become legend in the submarine service. He fired 19 torpedoes, sank 4 large freighters, and damaged 3 others, and escaped without receiving so much as a scratch. The Japanese Navy was hunting frantically for him. They had destroyers, patrol aircraft, and submarines all converging on the area. Flucky evaded them all, running silent through waters he had memorized during those 14 hours of surveillance. When the Barb returned to port, Flucky's crew had sunk over 30,000 tons of enemy shipping in a single patrol. It was one of the best records of any submarine in the war. But Flucky wasn't satisfied. He knew there was more they could do. The 7th and 8th patrols continued the pattern of aggressive success, but it was the 9th patrol, in January 1945, that would earn Flucky the Medal of Honor. The Barb was operating in the shallow waters of the East China Sea when lookouts spotted a massive Japanese convoy anchored in Namquan Harbor. Intelligence later confirmed it was one of the largest concentrations of enemy shipping in the entire theater. Over 30 ships, including several large tankers carrying desperately needed fuel for the Japanese war machine. The problem was that Namquan Harbor was a nightmare for submarines. The water was less than 40 feet deep in most places, barely enough to submerge the Barb. The harbor was ringed by coastal artillery and protected by minefields. A chain of islands created a natural barrier, with only a few narrow channels leading in or out, and Japanese patrol boats crisscrossed the area constantly. Every conventional analysis said an attack was impossible. The risks were simply too great. Flucky studied the harbor for 3 days, making detailed charts of every depth, every current, every patrol pattern. His officers pleaded with him to move on. Surely there were safer targets elsewhere. But Flucky had done the math. The fuel in those tankers could keep the Japanese military running for months. Destroying it would save American lives. At 9:30 p.m. on January 23, 1945, the Barb began her approach to Namquan Harbor. Flucky navigated by the light of burning buildings on shore, the result of earlier American air raids, weaving through the minefield using gaps he had identified during his surveillance. The Barb scraped bottom twice, her hull groaning against rocks that should have torn her apart. The crew held their breath and prayed. At 10:47 p.m., Flucky reached his firing position. The convoy lay before him, ships riding at anchor, completely unaware of the submarine that had materialized in their midst. Fire 1. The first torpedo leaped from its tube. Fire 2. Fire 3. Flucky emptied his forward torpedo tubes in less than a minute, then swung the Barb around and fired his stern tubes as well. 8 torpedoes were now racing toward the anchored ships. The first explosion lit up the night, then the second, then the third. One of the torpedoes struck an ammunition ship. The resulting blast was so massive that it was felt 30 miles away. The shockwave hit the Barb like a physical blow, shattering light bulbs and knocking men off their feet. Flucky didn't wait to assess the damage. He pointed the Barb toward the exit channel and ran at full speed, shells from the shore batteries splashing around him, patrol boats converging from every direction. They never caught him. Post-war analysis confirmed that the Barb sank or damaged 12 ships in Nam Quan Harbor that night, over 30,000 tons of enemy shipping, plus an ammunition ship, whose loss probably killed hundreds of Japanese sailors. For this action, Eugene Flucky received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his indomitable determination and extraordinary skill, noting that the attack exceeded the most optimistic expectations of the Naval Command. But Flucky himself was already thinking about his next mission. "We got lucky in Nam Quan," he told his crew. "Next time, we'll be even luckier." What he didn't tell them was what he was planning. Because even by Flucky's standards, his next idea was insane. The 10th and 11th Patrols continued the Barb's remarkable run of success. By the summer of 1945, the submarine had sunk over 90,000 tons of enemy shipping, one of the highest totals in the Pacific War. Flucky had been promoted, decorated, and praised by everyone from fleet commanders to newspaper reporters. But he was frustrated. Japan's merchant shipping had been virtually annihilated. There were simply fewer targets to sink. The enemy convoys that once filled the Pacific had dwindled to a trickle. Submarines that had once claimed dozens of kills per patrol were now returning empty-handed. Flucky refused to accept this new reality. If the targets weren't at sea, he would find them somewhere else. During the 11th Patrol, he had experimented with something new, rocket attacks on shore installations. The Navy had recently developed a 5-inch rocket launcher that could be mounted on a submarine's deck. Flucky was one of the first commanders to request the weapon. On June 22, 1945, the Barb surfaced off the coast of Japan and opened fire on the town of Shari on Hokkaido. 147 rockets streaked toward shore, destroying a factory complex and setting fires that burned for days. It was the first rocket attack on the Japanese home islands by any American vessel. But even this wasn't enough for Flucky. During the 11th Patrol, he had noticed something while surveying the coast of Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which Japan had controlled since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. A single-track railroad ran along the eastern coast, carrying supplies, equipment, and troops to Japanese bases throughout the region. The railroad was a vital artery, and it was completely undefended from the sea. Flucky stared at his charts and began to calculate. A submarine couldn't hit a railroad with torpedoes. The target was too small, too far inland. Rockets were too inaccurate. But if men could get ashore, if they could reach the tracks, if they could plant explosives. It had never been done before. Submarines were warships designed to sink other ships. Their crews were trained in underwater warfare, not commando operations. There was no doctrine, no equipment, no precedent for what Flucky was imagining. But that had never stopped him before. He approached his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert McNitt, with the idea. McNitt thought he was joking. When he realized Flucky was serious, he thought his captain had finally lost his mind. "We're submariners, Captain, not Marines, not Army. We don't do land operations." "We do now," Flucky replied. The planning began in earnest during the transit to the 12th Patrol area. Flucky gathered every piece of intelligence he could find about the Karafuto Railroad: schedules, guard positions, terrain, weather patterns. He sketched diagrams of the approach, the landing site, the target area. The biggest challenge was the explosives. The Barb carried scuttling charges, 55-pound blocks of TNT designed to sink the submarine if it was captured by the enemy. They had plenty of explosive power, but no detonator suitable for a train. The answer came from an unlikely source: Chief Electrician's mate, William Hatfield. Hatfield had been tinkering with electrical systems his entire career. When Flucky explained the problem, they needed a detonator that would trigger when the train passed over it. Hatfield disappeared into the Barb's engine room. He emerged 3 hours later with a modified microswitch, salvaged from the submarine's electrical system. "Put this under the rail," Hatfield explained. "When the train passes, the weight depresses the switch and completes the circuit. Boom." It was crude. It was improvised. It was genius. Flucky tested the mechanism by having men stand on it. The switch could handle up to 200 pounds without triggering. A fully loaded train car would weigh thousands. Now he needed volunteers. This is where Flucky's leadership philosophy paid its ultimate dividend. In any other submarine, with any other captain, asking for volunteers for a suicide mission onto enemy soil would have been met with reluctant compliance at best. Men would have stepped forward because they felt obligated, not because they wanted to. But Flucky had spent over a year building something different, He had created a crew that trusted him absolutely, that believed in his judgment, that knew he would never waste their lives on a foolish venture. When he announced that he needed 8 men to conduct a shore raid, every single member of the crew volunteered. All 82 men. Flucky was moved, but he had specific requirements. He chose men without families, reasoning that if the mission failed, at least no children would lose their fathers. He selected men with particular skills: Hatfield for his electrical expertise, Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders for his demolitions knowledge, and 6 others who had demonstrated the calm under pressure that the mission would require. The team practiced on the Barb's deck, rehearsing every movement in the darkness. They memorized the terrain from Flucky's hand-drawn maps. They learned to assemble the explosive device blindfolded, knowing that they might not be able to see their own hands on the night of the attack. And they waited. July 23, 1945. The Barb surfaced 300 yards off the coast of Carfudo, in a location Flucky had selected for its isolation. The shore was dark, no lights, no movement, no sign that the enemy knew they were there. Flucky gathered the shore party one final time. "You have 10 minutes from the moment you leave this boat. If you're not back in 10 minutes, we leave without you. There will be no rescue attempt. Do you understand?" 8 men nodded. "Then good luck. Make me proud." 2 rubber boats slipped over the side and paddled toward shore. Flucky watched through his periscope, his hands gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The boats reached the beach at 2:09 a.m. The men dragged them above the tide line and began moving inland. The railroad tracks were approximately 300 yards from the shore, across terrain that was rocky, uneven, and dotted with scrub vegetation. They moved in 2 groups. The first group, led by Lieutenant William Walker, would stand guard at either end of the worksite. The second group would plant the explosives. Chief Hatfield reached the tracks first. He ran his hands along the cold steel rail, found a spot where the ground was soft enough to dig, and began excavating. The others joined him, scooping dirt and rocks with their hands, working in total silence. The 55-pound scuttling charge was placed beneath the rail. Hatfield connected the micro switch, ran wires to the detonator, and armed the device. The entire process took 6 minutes. They were ahead of schedule, 90 seconds to spare. And then they heard the whistle. A train was coming, but it wasn't coming on schedule. Japanese trains in this region ran every few hours. The shore party had timed their attack to fall in the middle of a gap. The train wasn't supposed to arrive for another 45 minutes. Now it was screaming toward them, headlight cutting through the darkness, wheels pounding on the rails. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Then Walker made a decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of running, he ordered everyone to drop flat and stay still. Motion would attract attention. If they froze, there was a chance the train crew wouldn't see them in the darkness. 8 men pressed themselves against the earth as the train bore down on them. The locomotive passed first, a massive steam engine belching smoke and sparks. Then the cars began passing, one after another, each one shaking the ground. The men could feel the vibration in their bones. Hatfield lay closest to the tracks, close enough to touch the wheels as they thundered past. He watched the cars roll over the spot where he had buried the explosives and held his breath. But nothing happened. The microswitch was designed to trigger under the full weight of a stopped or slow-moving train. The vibration of a train passing at speed wasn't consistent enough to maintain the pressure needed to complete the circuit. 12 cars passed, 16, 20, and then the train was gone, its whistle fading into the distance. For several seconds, no one spoke. They lay in the darkness, hearts pounding, waiting for the Japanese soldiers who must surely be coming. No one came. Walker was the first to move. He checked his watch. They had now been ashore for 9 minutes. They had 1 minute to reach the boats. "Go," he whispered. "Go now." 8 men sprinted toward the beach. They covered 300 yards of unfamiliar terrain in the darkness, stumbling over rocks, crashing through bushes. They reached the boats, shoved off, and paddled furiously toward the waiting submarine. Flucky had watched the train pass with growing horror. He was certain his men had been discovered, certain they were dead or captured. When he saw the boats approaching through his periscope, he felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled his knees. The shore party scrambled aboard. The Barb submerged and moved away from the coast, putting distance between themselves and any Japanese patrol that might be searching for them. But the mission wasn't over. The explosives were still armed, still buried beneath the railroad tracks. Sooner or later, another train would come. And when it stopped or slowed at that spot to pick up passengers, to take on water, to wait for a crossing, the microswitch would activate. They waited. At 2:47 a.m., another train appeared on the coastal tracks. This one was different. Slower, heavier, clearly a freight train carrying supplies. Flucky watched it through his periscope, tracking its progress, estimating its speed. The train reached the spot where the explosives were buried and stopped. Later analysis suggested that the train had halted to wait for a signal, or perhaps to allow another train to pass. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was that for 15 seconds, the full weight of the locomotive pressed down on the microswitch. The explosion was enormous. The entire locomotive lifted off the tracks, a massive iron beast suddenly weightless, tumbling through the air like a child's toy. The first 4 cars derailed instantly, crashing into each other in a cascade of destruction. Fire erupted from the engine's boiler, igniting the wreckage. On the Barb, the crew heard the explosion and felt the shockwave ripple through the water. Men cheered, embraced, wept with joy. They had done it. They had actually done it. But Flucky wasn't celebrating yet. "Battle surface," he ordered. The Barb rose from the depths, her deck gun crew racing to their stations. Through his binoculars, Flucky surveyed the damage. The locomotive was utterly destroyed. At least 5 cars were burning. Secondary explosions suggested the train had been carrying ammunition. There was nothing more to shoot. "Secure the deck gun. Take her down." The Barb slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. The attack on the Carafuto Railroad remains the only land offensive in the history of the United States Navy conducted by submarine-launched personnel. It destroyed 1 locomotive, 16 railroad cars, and killed an estimated 150 Japanese soldiers and railroad workers. More importantly, it severed a vital supply line that the Japanese were unable to repair before the war ended 3 weeks later. But the real significance of the mission went far beyond military statistics. Eugene Flucky had proven that imagination could overcome any obstacle. He had shown that a small group of determined men, properly led, could accomplish what everyone said was impossible. He had demonstrated that the boundaries everyone accepted were not boundaries at all, just limits of imagination waiting to be broken. When the Barb returned to port after the 12th patrol, she flew a battle flag like none ever seen before. Alongside the traditional symbols for sunk ships, there was a new image, a locomotive. The crew called it the train flag. Flucky received the Navy Cross for the railroad attack, his 4th, adding to a collection that already included the Medal of Honor, but he always insisted that the real credit belonged to his crew. "I gave them an impossible mission," he said in an interview years later. "They made it possible." After the war, Flucky continued his naval career, eventually rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. He wrote a book about his experiences, Thunder Below, which became a classic of submarine literature. He remained active in veterans organizations, attending reunions with his Barb crewmates until his health no longer permitted. He died in June 2007 at the age of 93. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were scattered at sea over the waters where he had built his legend. The USS Barb itself was decommissioned in 1954 and later transferred to the Italian Navy, where she served as the Enrico Tazzoli until 1972. Today, nothing remains of her but memories and records, and the incredible stories of what she accomplished under Eugene Flucky's command. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Barb story isn't the missions themselves, it's what they reveal about leadership, trust, and human potential. Flucky took a group of ordinary men, electricians, machinists, cooks, and clerks, and transformed them into warriors who could accomplish the impossible. He did it not through fear or discipline, but through respect. He listened to his men, he valued their ideas, he trusted them with his life, and they trusted him with theirs. In the 90-day period of the 12th Patrol, the Barb sank or damaged 29 enemy vessels, bombarded 11 shore installations with rockets, and conducted the only successful land attack in submarine history. No other submarine in any navy had ever accomplished so much in a single patrol. And they did it because one man refused to accept limits. Eugene Flucky once wrote that the key to his success was simple. "I never told my men they couldn't do something. I always assumed they could, and they always proved me right." The 8 men who went ashore on Carafuto that night all survived the war. They returned to their homes, their families, their ordinary lives. Most never spoke publicly about what they had done. They didn't need recognition or praise. They knew what they had accomplished. And now so do you. The story of the USS Barb is more than a tale of wartime bravery. It's a reminder that the impossible is often just the untried. It's proof that leadership matters, that trust matters, that imagination matters. It's evidence that ordinary people, properly inspired, can accomplish extraordinary things. They said Flucky's men would die in 10 minutes. They planted explosives, triggered the largest land attack in submarine history, and were back aboard with seconds to spare. Never tell someone something is impossible. You might just be talking to the next Eugene Flucky. The Barb's 12th patrol wasn't finished when they blew up the train. Flucky still had torpedoes, still had rockets, and still had 3 weeks before the war would end. What happened in those final weeks would cement his legacy as the most aggressive submarine commander of World War II. The morning after the railroad attack, Flucky gathered his crew for a brief celebration. They had done something unprecedented, something that would be studied and debated for decades, but there was no time for extended celebration. "We still have a mission," Flucky reminded them. "The war isn't over. There are still targets. There are still lives we can save by hitting the enemy hard." The men returned to their stations. Over the next 2 weeks, the Barb continued its rampage along the coast of Karafuto and Hokkaido. On July 25th, 2 days after the train attack, Flucky located a convoy of sampans, small Japanese fishing vessels that the enemy had converted into patrol boats. Normally, submarines ignored sampans. They were too small to waste torpedoes on, and their wooden hulls made them poor targets for deck guns. Flucky didn't ignore them. He surfaced in the middle of the sampan fleet at dawn, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. His deck gun crew opened fire while the torpedo crews prepared for larger targets. In 45 minutes, the Barb sank 23 sampans and damaged a dozen more. It wasn't glamorous work. The sampans were not warships, but each one carried supplies, each one supported the enemy war effort, and each one would never serve Japan again. 3 days later, Flucky found bigger prey. A Japanese patrol frigate, approximately 800 tons, was operating off the coast of Karafuto. These ships were designed specifically to hunt submarines. They carried depth charges, sonar, and trained crews that knew how to prosecute an underwater contact. Standard doctrine called for submarines to avoid patrol frigates whenever possible. Flucky attacked on the surface in broad daylight. The frigate's crew spotted the Barb at approximately 4,000 yards and immediately began closing for attack. They must have thought the submarine would dive. That's what submarines always did when confronted by anti-submarine vessels. Instead, the Barb turned toward them and increased speed. Flucky's plan was audacious, but logical. Patrol frigates were lightly armored. Their depth charges were useless against a surface target. If he could close the range fast enough, his deck gun would have the advantage. The two vessels raced toward each other, guns blazing. Shells from the frigate splashed around the Barb, some coming terrifyingly close. One hit the water close enough to spray the deck with shrapnel, wounding 2 men. But the Barb's gunners were better. At 2,200 yards, a shell from the 4-inch gun struck the frigate's bridge. At 1,800 yards, another hit her engine room. The Japanese ship slowed, began to list, and suddenly became a sitting target. Flucky didn't finish her with the deck gun. He wanted to save ammunition for future engagements. "Prepare forward torpedo tubes. 1 fish should be enough." A single torpedo sent the frigate to the bottom. By the time the Barb received orders to return to port, her record for the 12th Patrol defied comprehension. In addition to the railroad attack, she had sunk or damaged 32 vessels of various sizes, bombarded 11 coastal installations with rockets, and engaged in surface gun battles with enemy warships. The patrol had lasted 90 days. Flucky had been in combat for most of them. But something happened on August 6th that changed everything. The Barb was running on the surface, heading toward a rendezvous point, when the radio crackled with an encrypted message. The communications officer decoded it and brought it to Flucky with a troubled expression. "Captain, this message makes no sense." Flucky read it twice before he understood. A single American aircraft had dropped a new type of bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb had destroyed the entire city in a single instant. Casualties were estimated in the hundreds of thousands. No one on the Barb had heard of an atomic bomb. No one believed that such a weapon was possible. But the message was clear. The war would end soon. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The Barb received orders to proceed to Hawaii immediately. The war was over. For the crew, the end came with mixed emotions. They had survived. They had won. But there was also a strange sense of loss. The mission that had defined them, the purpose that had united them, was suddenly complete. Flucky gathered his crew one final time. "And we did something on this patrol that no one else has ever done," he said. "We proved that the impossible is just a word. We proved that courage and imagination can overcome any obstacle. We proved that ordinary men can accomplish extraordinary things." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "When you go home, when you return to your families and your jobs and your normal lives, remember what we did here. Remember what you're capable of. And never let anyone tell you that something can't be done." The Barb arrived in Pearl Harbor on September 1st, 1945. A crowd was waiting on the dock, naval officers, reporters, photographers, and families of the crew. The train flag flew proudly from the periscope shears. In the following weeks, the story of the railroad attack spread across America. Newspapers called it the most daring raid of the war. Radio programs dramatized the mission. Flucky and his crew became celebrities. But the attention made Flucky uncomfortable. He consistently deflected praise toward his men, insisting that he was just the one who gave orders while they did the actual work. Any fool can dream up crazy ideas, he told one reporter. The hard part is finding men brave enough and skilled enough to make them reality. I found those men on the Barb. The crew members scattered after the war, returning to their homes across America. Some stayed in the Navy, pursuing careers that had been launched by their service on the Barb. Others left the military entirely, becoming businessmen, teachers, engineers, farmers. But they never forgot what they had accomplished. Every few years, the Barb veterans would gather for a reunion. They would share stories, look at old photographs, and remember the young men they had been. As the decades passed and their numbers dwindled, these reunions became increasingly precious. Eugene Fluckey attended every reunion until the last years of his life. He remembered every man's name, every mission, every moment of danger and triumph. The crew that had volunteered to follow him into impossible situations remained family until the end. The last reunion was held in 2004. Only a handful of original crew members were still alive. They gathered in a hotel conference room, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia, and raised glasses to fallen comrades. Fluckey, 91 years old and frail but still sharp, gave the final toast. To the Barb, he said, to the men who served her, and to the impossible things we did together. 3 years later, he was gone. But his legacy endures. The United States Navy still studies the Barb's patrols at the Naval War College. Submarine commanders learn about Fluckey's tactics, his leadership, his willingness to challenge conventional thinking. The railroad attack is taught as an example of what becomes possible when imagination is combined with courage. More than that, the story of the Barb has inspired countless people who never served in the military, never set foot on a submarine, never faced combat. It's a story about human potential, about what happens when someone refuses to accept limits, about the power of trust between leaders and those they lead. They said Fluckey's men would die in 10 minutes. Instead, they became legends. And that's the lesson that matters most. Not the tonnage sunk, not the medals earned, not the battles won. The lesson is that the impossible is never truly impossible. It's just waiting for someone brave enough, creative enough, and stubborn enough to prove everyone wrong. Eugene Fluckey spent his entire career proving people wrong. He was too small for submarines, until he wasn't. His tactics were too reckless, until they worked. Landing men on enemy soil was impossible, until 8 men crawled across a Japanese beach and blew up a train. Every limit he encountered turned out to be imaginary. Every boundary he reached turned out to be movable. Every impossible thing he attempted turned out to be merely difficult. That's the gift he gave to everyone who served under him. That's the gift he gave to everyone who hears his story. The knowledge that limits are lies we tell ourselves, the proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. The next time someone tells you something can't be done, think of Eugene Fluckey. Think of 8 men crawling through the darkness on foreign soil. Think of a microswitch improvised from submarine parts. Think of a train lifted off its tracks by men who had no business being there. And then do it anyway. Because the impossible is just a word. And words can be changed. They said Fluckey's men would die in 10 minutes. They planted explosives, triggered the largest land attack in submarine history, and were back aboard with seconds to spare. Never tell someone something is impossible. You might just be talking to the next Eugene Fluckey. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what's possible, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories from history. And remember, the limits we accept are just limits of imagination. The next impossible thing is waiting to be done. Maybe by you.